contextualizing public housing, connecting it to a larger set of strategies that are going on, and that's the things, when we wrote our book, where For People to Live, we really situated the public housing transformation in the policy context, and, you know, pointed fingers and named names in terms of the Clinton administration and what they were trying to do, and the Daley administration and what they were trying to do. So, but we focused on the public housing, but when I look at it now, and I think, you know, the fact that in 10 years, you know, we lost 180,000 black people. We lost 200,000 people in a decade in the city of Chicago, but most of them were black. And the first thing I get in the morning, the day after the census is released, are emails from everyone around the country to me saying, is that because of public housing? And I'm like, no, actually it's not, because not that many public housing residents left the city, first of all. Many stayed within the city. Most, if they took, when they moved out with vouchers, they didn't leave the city. They didn't even really leave the county, despite what, you know, people in Danville and, you know, Galesburg say. You know, when they see a black person, they go, must be public housing, you know. So, but my point of that is that that doesn't explain it. But what does explain that loss of population are some of the same goals and strategies that public housing was manifested in one way. It was a very overt policy decision, given free reign to do this on this sort of premise, by the way, by liberal do-gooders who are like, we're going to do mixed income housing. And sorry, I know some of those people are still older. But, you know, making policy decisions, they really believed in something that they had no evidence was going to have any impact at all whatsoever on poverty, let alone just, you know, people being able to live, yeah. And so, but then okay, so why, so there's that, but then how do you explain the exploitation of, you know, and the mortgage sort of craziness that was going on in Inglewood concurrently? Well, I think they're part of the same set of strategies, which is using the land to kind of capitalize on, you know, and accumulate wealth. And so it's a land grab in different forms. And public housing residents were calling it land grab, not me. I'm not, you know, I got to give them credit. And that was what residents, they did a great video on land grab in, you know, the 90s, remember that? It was like, and, so I think that, you know, how do you contextualize this and kind of put it into that, but using real experiences. So that's why I was thinking when you were talking about it, it is sort of telling the same story, it's just in different places that it's happening, and happening in slightly different ways, or different mechanisms triggering it.
You know, I think we often try to say that what's going on in public housing is somehow different, but let me illustrate why it's not. Okay, I remember back when the Residence Journal was part of. This is a little anecdotal, but I think if you let me lay it out, I'll make a point eventually. That back when the Residence Journal was part of the CHA, you know, we were part of the CHA structure, and I was sitting in my boss's office at the Housing Authority. This was the Deputy Executive Director, the second in command of the agency. He got a phone call, and I just remember the look on his face. This was a pretty volatile but imperturbable person. You know, like he could get angry, but I never saw him like shocked and surprised in this way. And he was talking on the phone, and just kept saying, "What? Someone had raised a tiger cub in Robert Taylor Homes, in an apartment in Robert Taylor. I'm sorry Ms. Thomas left because I wanted to ask her if she remembered it. Maybe you remember, Jamie, or any of you guys. That someone had raised a tiger cub. They brought a tiger cub into Robert Taylor, and they kept feeding it, and they, you know, and eventually the tiger got too big to cold out. Yeah. And, you know, and the guy for a couple of weeks was throwing, you know, meat that he bought from Jewel into the apartment, and, you know, but after a few weeks he realized this wasn't going to work, and neighbors were starting to complain about strange animal noises coming from the next apartment and whatnot, and so he called the Housing Authority and announced, I have a tiger in my apartment, you know, which, you know, the Housing Authority actually was pretty well equipped for this bizarre problem, because they, you know, made a couple of phone calls, and they got some animal rescue, some tiger rescue folks to come, and they took care of the tiger, and everything was good. So this was in my head for many years, the story that was only in public housing could this kind of thing happen, right? A few years ago, I moved into a condominium development on the north side, and I was shortly thereafter drafted to be on the condo board. Not something I'd ever considered, but, you know, I like to get involved in stuff, and I thought it would be a good way to get to know the building. And, you know, so it's about 125 units in the development in Bucktown. And have you guys ever heard of that restaurant, The Girl and Her Goat?
Yes.
Yeah. You've heard of that. So I'm going to give you one guess as to where the goat lived before it took up residence in the restaurant.
One of the apartments.
And I made the maintenance man for the building, who is a Bosnian refugee, who's in a concentration camp in Bosnia. I want you to put all these things kind of together, right? Discovered the goats because he was, people were complaining about strange animal noises coming from a neighbor's apartment. And one day he followed a trail of straw through the hallway and came to, he grew up on a farm, so he knew immediately what it was when he listened through the doorway, even though he didn't really believe it. Okay? That's one of the things that, again, I was like, oh, so people keeping livestock or wild animals in their apartment, I guess that happens everywhere. Another thing, you guys all know about Governor Rod Blagojevich and that he's now in prison, but if you remember back, that someone was wearing a wire to record his conversations, a guy named John Weimer. Okay? John Weimer had to plead guilty to a federal crime. He's a convicted felon, right? I'll give you one guess as to where John Weimer lives. Right? So we have convicted felons, in other words, right? High-level convicted felons, and I know he's not the only one.
But he doesn't keep goats.
That's a separate person.
Good. I was like, that'd be just too wacky.
Well, to be fair, the Robert Taylor resident who had a tiger also was probably not a felon.
Right. So they're mutually exclusive.
That's right. So you have categories of people that keep animals and categories of people who are felons, and
So there it is.
Yeah. And what I'm trying to say is that everything that goes on, if you look honestly at a community of human beings, everything that goes on in public housing goes on everywhere else. You take random population of human beings, right? In any building, in any structure, you're going to get the same kind of stories.
Yeah. And two things. One is just to indulge another anecdote along these lines. I lived where I grew up in Canada, 48th Street, and I've always lived, I seem to have spent my whole life within a block or a block and a half of the sort of residential center of the Nation of Islam. So, Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Farrakhan. And there was a period when Muhammad Ali lived in this immediate area. And he came back, and you remember this is, I live in one of the mansions at the moment, but this is the Kenwood of large mansions where Barack and Michelle Obama lived and Valerie Jarrett. And Muhammad Ali came back from the rumble in the jungle in Zaire with a lion cub that Mobutu had given him that he put in the front yard in a cage. And so you walk your dog and, this great kind of growling. And the lion got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the growling got louder and louder and louder, and it became a kind of animal, welfare issue in the neighborhood. So just like the condo association kind of issue, negotiating with Muhammad Ali, the lions became. But I do think, I think the larger point, there are 2 points that have been in play that I think are, again, important by way of these kind of things to think about at the threshold of what you're doing early in the process. One was suggested by something I think Janet said, that this is a really interesting moment. We've said some disheartening things, but it's a really interesting moment for this undertaking because a set of paradigms that have governed this phase of urban, whatever you want to call it, reconstruction, are exhausted. Nobody has serious conviction about mixed income, blah, 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 So there's a kind of a space, and it could be a really creative space if people occupy it, enter it, contest false narratives, ask interesting questions. The other thing is part of the official narrative, and journalism has often contributed to this. Part of the official narrative is this world apart. Public housing is a world apart, this parallel universe, a solar system. And there's a trope about kids who've never seen the lake, who grew up and never seen it. Above the 8th floor of any of the buildings on South State Street, you have fabulous views of the lake and the skyline. I've sat with, people who wax eloquent about the different moods of the lake, just like somebody living on Sheridan Drive. And of course, there are profound conditions of abandonment. That's a different point. But the notion that people were somehow not part of a larger society, not watching the same shows on television, not, rooting for the same sports teams. And you'll indulge me anytime having told an anecdote. One of the sort of emblematic stories for me of this is I worked a lot with both gang nations at Stateway and was known broadly inside them and was in and out of buildings all the time. And I came into one of the buildings late at night and badly lit, and even if you didn't have direct experiences and you've seen The Wire, you kind of have some sense of how the drug trade works. So you had, drug dealing in these open air lobbies and concentric circles of security, people looking after lookouts, people calling out the names of drugs and drawing people into particular sites. And then as you would go further in, there was a practice of patting down people who were unknown to the drug dealers. It wasn't so much fear of the police who made their presence known pretty emphatically when they came. It was more fear of getting stuff up, and having either the drug package or not ripped off. For residents in the building, or someone who was around all the time, to get patted down is kind of offensive. It's trying to into a space that you inhabit. And one night, a guy must have just gotten out of prison, didn't know me, going somewhere in the building, guy steps forward to pat me down. And a voice from the shadows in the lobby, who was a guy who, to this day, I don't know his name, but his street name was C.O., which I doubt that changes the gender. And he was a very kind of charming, wily, interesting guy who I tried several times to recruit for the NCC. And he said, Jamie, I really like you, and I'd love to work with you as long as it's nothing legal. So nothing legal. So he was a gangster, he was a crook, he was a lifetime criminal. And so the voice rings, this guy's coming forward to pat him down, and a voice rings out from the shadows, and don't mess with him. He's a player, that's Jacques Cousteau. So my street name in the Life Disciple Nation is Jacques Cousteau. I run in Washington Park almost every day, and guys will go bouncing by, lean me back, gangster lean, and they're like, yo, Jacques! But what's really interesting about that story is here's this, menace to society guy who had grown up in this raggedy-ass building, and I was up on the 13th floor watching WTTW, Our Window to the World. He not only knew who Jacques Cousteau was, he knew that was an extremely witty remark to me. Well, also, you're this kind of white guy. You're this white guy who's not a cop, not a social worker, kind of cool, kind of like sport, but swimming in another medium. I mean, it's a really cool remark. So, but what it suggests about, we live in the same place. We just have these crazy social distances we impose.
But I'd like to talk for a minute, getting back to the question that you asked, if I may. And I think it relates to all of this and what my current personal struggle is. I'm trying to deal with it, and I'm not going to say it's the right way. I have found that all too often when I try to contest the given narrative, I'm preaching to the choir. Occasionally, if I give it a twist, I give it an architectural twist. Are the buildings to blame for the failure of public housing? So I get an architectural audience. Okay, but by and large, and some of them, start to scratch their heads because what I'm telling you is quite different than the conventional wisdom. But as a whole, most of my preaching is to is about. So we're trying to figure out what to do. So. I have been working at Cabrini Green with the residents, and also the Court Decree, as you are. And I was able to interview the last family that was in the last building that was being torn down. They were being evicted by court. They had objected to leaving. Oh, and I got she was terrific. Photographer and a videographer. This is all through the National Public Housing Museum. And the stories were heart-wrenching. Especially the stories about where they wanted to place her. She went to look at one, and the windows were busted out. You know, so you're getting this phenomenal story, right? Okay, from the trenches. And then I'm saying, okay, what the hell am I going to do with it, right? And one of the issues at the National Public Housing Museum is how do we bring people in and contest the conventional narrative, but bring other people in who normally would never set foot. Right? Like, who would go to a National Public Housing Museum? And this is how do you create audience? So I can tell you what we're doing. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but I said, okay, I got to hit a general audience. I have to be in their face. So I happen to know someone, her name is Leslie Thomas, she's the executive director of Art Works Projects, and she does in-your-face exhibits about humanitarian crises elsewhere, in which she literally projects people in crisis, images done by phenomenal photojournalists, on the walls of buildings. She got Darfur projected on the walls of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and then the Eiffel Tower. Okay, in your face, where you can't avoid it. So we decided this is what we were going to do. Okay, so then we said, all right, are we going to do it about Chicago public housing? We're going to put it on the building that we have that we're trying to raise money to renovate. Well, do we really want to isolate public housing residents, or do we want to frame it as a more general story? So we've decided it's going to be a more general story about housing.